All right, here we go. Hello again. We're just doing overviews of this week's reading on labor. And so here we have chapter 12. There's actually three sections from chapter 12, so that's why the last three readings are all chapter 12. But the first one covers working conditions. And so working conditions. First question, what are two economic effects of mandating improved working conditions? Who ends up paying for those conditions? And again, so he's talking about the idea of working conditions not only implies the environment in which employees work, which is I think is what pops into my mind at least, but it also includes the hours that they work. It includes the benefits that they're given. It includes the training they receive. It just involves everything other than the salary, everything surrounding the environment and the circumstances in which somebody works. And he said, and so he gets into the big move today is that we need to not only have minimum wage laws that mandate and control what employers can pay, and they have to pay a living wage, but we need to control all the benefits they provide, the health care, the actual physical environment, the number of hours they can work, the number of paid sick days and vacation days they're given. All those things fall under working conditions. And he gets into, so he goes, what are the two economic effects when this starts to happen and these start to be imposed, not voluntarily offered by a firm, but mandated by government? And he says, well, the two effects are lower pay for the workers and higher unemployment overall. And because what you're doing when you're mandating these labor conditions, you are imposing a cost on the firm. You're imposing a cost on the firm that makes labor more expensive. Again, an employer simply makes his decisions based on how much it costs to produce a certain good or service. And when you mandate an expense added to the working conditions in any of the forms I just described, then you are raising his cost. And if you raise his cost, that makes the labor or the cost of having employees more expensive. So one, they can't pay their employees as much, so that's the lower pay. So actually, they're getting a lower salary because more money is going to the different benefits. I've seen this all the time where you hire an employee and it's like, oh, here's your wages, and it's like, here's your salary or whatever. And then, by the way, here's what we're paying for your health insurance, or here's what we're paying for your retirement, or here's what we're paying for all these other things. And you can see the cost to an employer goes way beyond just the salary or the wages for their workers, depending on what kind of working conditions and benefits are being offered or potentially imposed. And so if those weren't imposed, then the pay to the employees could be higher. Um, and also, of course, higher unemployment, because when labor becomes more expensive, then firms can't offer as many jobs. They're going to try to do as much work with fewer workers, whether through capital investments that make them more efficient, or with working the employees they currently have with overtime. And that's what he says. A lot of times, kind of a third effect of this is people work a lot more overtime because it's cheaper for firms to get more out of their current employees than to add employees and incur more of those mandated working condition costs. So again, the two effects are lower pay and higher unemployment, and then to some extent more overtime. And so who pays for these? So even though you think, oh, things you're getting benefits, or there's better working conditions, even the physical environment potentially, the workers are paying for that. The workers are paying for that because they're losing out on their salary. And so you're not really getting it for free. You're just getting it in the form of a benefit or different working condition rather than in your paycheck. And the unemployed are paying the price because there's fewer jobs in the marketplace as a result of these mandated working conditions. So the workers lose it in their pay, and then the unemployed lose it because there are fewer available jobs. Number two is, then he makes, why does the safety aspect of working conditions, this is what, again, maybe we often think of with a specific term, working conditions, why does the physical safety of the working conditions differ from other areas as one benefiting from external laws and regulations? So he basically separates out safety, physical safety, from all the other things I mentioned, like hours, vacation days, healthcare, benefits, retirement, all that sort of thing. And he says it's good, mandating, regulating from external laws by the government, safety conditions is a good thing and a necessary thing. So again, it's not like no regulation and nothing should be mandated. He says this is the actual job of the government. And the reason he says this is different is because safety involves externalities. If you remember, we went over regulation a couple months ago, that regulation is necessary when because you have in business, or you have in capitalism, these agreements or these negotiations between employers and employees, or buyers and sellers. And as long as they both agree, there's no reason to intervene because both sides say, yeah, I'll pay you this much and I'll work for this much, and we've agreed on that. And so it's a mutual contract, or it's a mutual agreement, except when a third party is potentially harmed by that decision. Because then in a sense, there's a third party who's not privy to the negotiation, whose voice isn't being heard, and yet the other two groups making that decision are going to harm them. And that's what they call externalities. We made an agreement, but now we're hurting somebody else. And so that has to be taken into consideration. We can't just ignore that and say we've made a good agreement, because now somebody else is actually paying the price for our agreement, whether in the form of pollution or whether in the form of harmful things that we're doing to the environment or endangering them. He uses the example of hours that truckers can drive or train, people can operate machinery and things, because if they are dangerous, they're not only going to kill themselves, but they could harm other people on the road, or they could have accidents that could pollute the environment, or they could be, again, hurting a third party that didn't agree, that wasn't part of this agreement of between the employer and the employees. And so he says that's when regulation is necessary. And that's why we need safety laws. They need to step in and say, hey, we represent the third party. We represent the other people affected by your decision. And so you might agree to work for to want to work fly a jet, and you're willing to work all these incredible hours so you can make all this pay, and they're willing to pay you for that, but you're endangering the passengers, you're endangering the stewardesses, you're endangering whatever. And so there has to be safety regulations on what is allowed. He says that is a good externally mandated thing, because again, it brings in the issue of externalities. But if there's not a third party being bothered or harmed by it, then who's to step in and say, well, those working conditions aren't acceptable? Because if the employer and the employee have agreed to it, and if somebody says, I don't want you to pay my health care, I just want you to pay a higher salary, who's to step in and say that that's not okay? But safety, he says, he separates it out. Safety is different, and that's why we've got this question looking at it specifically. All right, number 3, what are the unintended effects of mandated work hour restrictions on firms? How does it affect workers? How does it affect society? The 3 groups. And so this is the same idea, working conditions, but one area is work hour. That we shouldn't allow people, or businesses can't work people a certain number of hours a week, or they have to work. They can only work them fewer hours a week, and they still have to pay them the same. Also, a lot of this stuff he compares with what's going on in Europe, and the U.S. tends to want to chase Europe sometimes, which is not in our best interest. But it's the same idea. It's the same principle, as it raises the cost of labor. If you're saying you're going to work fewer hours and I'm still going to pay you the same, I just made the cost of having those employees more expensive. And so the effect on firm is they're going to have to cut costs. If you're making their labor more expensive, then they're going to have to cut costs. And that's either means they're going to hire fewer employees, they're going to have fewer employees, they're going to have to put money into, again, capital investment, and just do the same number of work with fewer employees. Again, you heard Mr. Sorry, his name's how Burger King, as they raise the minimum wage and make it more expensive to have employees, he's like, well, I'm just going to get rid of the employees, and I'm going to have kiosks, and I'm going to have kiosks taking people's orders because it's too expensive for me to have these employees. Again, you mandate something for the working conditions of the employees, and all you do is basically destroy their jobs because you're making it too expensive for the employers to have them. So again, but that gets getting for firms, they have to cut costs, they have to cut jobs, they have to increase capital investment. The effect on workers is higher unemployment, because now they're too expensive. Nobody wants them, or there's less demand for them, because again, it's not just my salary, it's and I get that salary and I only work a some number of hours, and so I'm more expensive. So higher unemployment for the workers. And then he says for the society as a whole, for the economy, for the national economy, which again, you might think, well, who cares about the national economy? Well, no, that's the world in which you live. The state of your economy determines all of our standard of living, and the rate of innovation, and the level of prosperity, and how we get things, and how our needs are met with scarce resources with alternative uses. And he says we want to, as the society as a whole becomes less efficient with any of these things that artificially raise the cost of labor and then have these effects, that's a less efficient use of the resources of that society, in particular our labor. If people can't get the jobs they want because of artificially mandated restrictions on their working conditions, then labor is not going to where it would be best used. and it's not being run efficiently. And so that means that society is not being as productive and efficient with its resources, in particular its people and their skills and their labor, as it could be. And so again, anything that artificially raises the cost of labor forces job cuts and cost cuts for the firms. It creates higher unemployment for the workers, and it makes the society as a whole less efficient and less able to get its maximal use of its resources. And finally, number 4, what mistake is often made when evaluating working conditions in third world countries? How are the effects of mandated working conditions similar to the effects of minimum wage laws? So then he brings up basically kind of this idea of maybe the sweatshop idea, or the idea of working conditions in the third world countries. And he says, a lot of times we sit there and we say, here's the standards we have in the United States. Look what they're doing over in Malaysia. Look what they're doing over in Taiwan, or look what they're doing over in the Philippines. And he says we make the mistake of projecting our first world standards or our first world market conditions onto another market. In other words, labor in the United States costs a certain amount because it has a certain level of productivity. You can't sit there and say, well, that's the exact same thing in the Philippines, or that's the exact same thing in Malaysia, or in Mexico, or in Guatemala. And that if you look into these other nations, that you don't want to just translate the market conditions from one to the other. He says, our standards of living, our standards of pay, the cost of our labor, those things are not arbitrary. We didn't just pull it out of the sky and say, you know what, I think everyone should make this much money and work this many hours, and so that's the standard for the human race across the planet. He says, no, these standards have come from the ground up based on our productivity, what we're worth. And again, people get all freaky when you start to say things. Well, what am I worth? What is my labor worth? But that's a real number, and it varies from country to country, town to town, industry to industry, nation to nation. And you can only have a functioning economy that's efficient if people are being paid according to the level of productivity or the value. And you can't just impose um, those certain standards and say, okay, everybody around the world is only going to work this many hours in this type of working condition and have this kind of benefits. It's not a one size fit all. It has to reflect the actual market conditions. Um, and that many countries are in a different place in the economic process than American workers. Um, and he points out, he goes, and again, he gives the powerful stories of also that, what seems like, nothing to us, dirt pay, or something we couldn't survive on here in the United States, is very attractive, is very beneficial, is extremely desirable in another context, in another nation. And that there, what we might, oh my gosh, $2 an hour, or we hear something like that and we think, oh, that's slavery, or that's modern day cruelty. Well, no, you have to look at the context of that market and say, no, that's actually a really high wage for that market. Or to only work that many hours, or to work in that kind of condition, that is actually an improvement relative to that market, relative to that country. That is actually benefiting those people, and people are lining up for those jobs. People are fighting for those jobs because it's an opportunity for them. And we can't project our standards and what we're used to here into these other contexts. And so it's really important, because you make a terrible mistake just putting your own standards and your own context on these other situations, and then to sit there, and then if you impose these again, arbitrary standards, saying no, everyone's going to have these same standards that we in the United States have decided we think are acceptable, then you're actually going to again raise the cost of labor. That's what minimum wage laws do. They raise the cost of labor, therefore they create a shortage of demand of firms, which is a surplus of people who want those jobs, and that just means unemployment. And so if you want to impose these standards, first world standards, onto third world markets, then you're going to create unemployment, and you're going to destroy the jobs that actually many of the people in those countries want. And he says that's dangerous for two reasons. One, it's unemployment. So again, that's inefficient, and people aren't getting the jobs that would actually be a great opportunity for them. And two, he says they're not static. Just because the standard of living, or the value of the productivity in those third world nations are lower than the United States now, he says that's not going to be that way forever. Over time, as industries and multinational corporations invest in those regions, then the value of the people's work there, as they gain experience, and as they create a different labor market more reflective of places like the United States or Europe, then they're going to have higher productivity, and then they will their wages and their job working conditions will go up. because what you're doing is you're introducing competition into those labor markets, and over time, their standard of living will rise, just like what happened in the United States. It's going to take time. Like I said, there's somewhere else in this process. Um, but the answer isn't to impose these higher costs of labor on these markets and therefore destroy the jobs. And therefore, fewer people are going to invest in there, and that's going to create less competition. And so then that's not going to create more opportunities for the workers there. And so he says, no, over time, they will build human capital, and the worth of workers and productivity of those workers will rise. And eventually you'll see the standard of living rising closer and closer to what we seem to enjoy here in the United States. And he says this is already happening. It's already happened to a huge degree in China, where competition has increased because it was so affordable. And then what that does over time is it raises the value of workers and the different benefits and the working conditions they can get. So again, it's very dangerous. It's a mistake to project our working conditions and our labor situation onto other markets, because then we destroy the opportunities that can create in those countries. Um, Again, overall, the theme throughout all this is the artificial imposition of making labor more expensive. And if we do that, then that's going to create fewer opportunities for people to be employed. All right, we'll see you for the next section.